Sometimes a man spends his whole life looking for a place to call home, only to find it in the last place anyone expected. When 60-year-old drifter Emory Tate inherits his uncle's broken-down ranch in the Wyoming wilderness, the whole town laughs behind his back. They call it a fool's errand, a shack fit only for ghosts and regret. But Emory rides out anyway, with nothing but his bedroll and a stubborn donkey named Maudie. What he finds there changes everything. Beneath the floorboards of that forsaken cabin lies a fortune in gold and secrets tied to his uncle's outlaw past. Now Emory must decide what kind of man he wants to be in the time he has left. Can buried treasure truly buy redemption, or will the past claim what was never meant to be found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bus dropped Emory Tate at the edge of cold water. Wyoming on a November morning so cold the air felt like it could crack. He stood there on the gravel shoulder with his duffel bag and watched the greyhound pull away, its exhaust hanging white in the still air. 60 years old, and he'd never owned much more than what fit in that bag. Clothes, a razor, a paperback western he'd read 3 times, and a photograph of his mother taken before the world got complicated. Cold water wasn't much to look at. Main Street ran 4 blocks before it gave up and turned to dirt. False front buildings painted in faded blues and greens lined both sides, the kind of town that had seen better days and made peace with it. A grain elevator rose at the far end like a tired sentinel. Pickup trucks angled into parking spaces, most of them 20 years old or older. The mountains beyond town stood white-capped and distant, beautiful in that hard way that mountains are when winter's coming on. Emory had worked a lifetime of odd jobs across 7 states. Ranch hand in Montana, stable manager in Colorado, saloon keeper in a New Mexico town whose name he'd already forgotten. He'd mended fences, broken horses, dealt cards, and poured whiskey for men who looked just like him, drifters with no roots and no particular place to be. He'd never married, never bought land, never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. That was just how his life had gone, one season flowing into the next, like water finding the path of least resistance. But now something had changed. 3 weeks ago, a letter had found him at a rooming house in Cheyenne. Lawyer's letterhead, formal language, the kind of thing that makes a man's stomach tighten. His uncle Silas had died. Emory hadn't seen Silas since he was 12 years old. One summer in 1977, when the man had visited for 3 days and then vanished into what his mother called business out west. Silas had been a cipher after that, a name his mother refused to discuss. And now, impossibly, Silas had left Emory everything he owned. The law office sat above the hardware store, accessed by an outside staircase that creaked under Emory's boots. The sign read, "Cross and Associates," though Emory figured there weren't any associates in a town this size. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and coffee left too long on the burner. A secretary with gray hair and sharp eyes looked up from her desk. "Help you?" "Emory Tate. I've got an appointment with Mr. Cross." Something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or judgment. Hard to say. She picked up her phone and murmured into it, then gestured toward a door. "Go on in." Wendell Cross was a thin man in his 50s, with the kind of neat appearance that comes from small-town professionalism. His handshake was firm but quick, like he didn't want to hold on too long. He motioned Emory to a chair and settled behind his desk with a manila folder. "Mr. Tate, thank you for making the trip." Cross opened the folder, studying papers he'd clearly read 100 times already. "I'll be direct with you. Your Uncle Silas passed 6 weeks ago. Heart failure, the doctor said. He was 78, left no wife, no children. You're his only living relative." "I hadn't heard from him in 47 years, Emory said quietly. "Yes, well." Cross cleared his throat. He lived simply, kept to himself. The property's been vacant since his death. He'd actually moved into town his last few years. Rented a room at the boarding house. The ranch was just sitting out there. What kind of condition is it in? Cross's expression told Emory everything before the man spoke. "Honestly, it's rough. The cabin's standing, but that's about the best you can say. Windows broken, roof needs work. The barn's mostly collapsed. It's 320 acres, decent grazing land if you put work into it, but it's isolated. 15 miles from town, last 5 miles barely a road. Most folks would call it more trouble than it's worth. Most folks aren't inheriting it, Emory said. A faint smile touched Cross's lips. No, I suppose not. He pushed papers across the desk. Deeds here. All legal and recorded. Property taxes are current through the year. Silas was meticulous about that at least. There's also a small savings account, about $3,000. That's yours too. Emory signed where Cross indicated. The deed felt heavy in his hands, heavier than paper should feel. Did my uncle have friends here? Anyone who knew him well? Cross hesitated. Silas kept to himself, like I said. Polite enough, but private. People remembered him from years back when he was younger. There were stories, but he stopped himself. Small towns talk, Mr. Tate. Doesn't mean there's truth in it. What kind of stories? Old stories. Rumors from the 70s and 80s about smuggling routes through the mountains. Nothing proven, nothing charged. Your uncle was never arrested, never even questioned as far as I know. But the Tate name carried certain associations. Fair or not, that's how it is. Emory folded the deed and tucked it in his jacket. Anything else I should know? The property's yours free and clear. What you do with it is your business. Cross stood, indicating the meeting was over. There's a general store on Main Street, Caldwell's. Martha can set you up with supplies if you're planning to stay out there. And Sheriff Donovan will want to know you're in town. Just courtesy. The handshake goodbye was just as brief as the first. Emory descended the creaky stairs into the cold afternoon, feeling the weight of the deed against his chest. Around him, Coldwater went about its business with the slow, methodical pace of a town that had learned not to hurry. He could feel eyes on him, though, faces turning away when he looked, the way people do when they're talking about you and don't want you to know. Caldwell's general store occupied a corner lot with big windows and a wooden porch that sagged in the middle. Bell chimed when Emory pushed through the door. Inside, the place was organized chaos, shelves crammed with everything from canned goods to rope to work gloves. A woman in her 60s stood behind the counter, gray-haired and solid-looking, with eyes that assessed him quickly. "You must be Emory Tate," she said. Not hostile, but not particularly warm either. News travels fast. It's a small town. "I'm Martha Caldwell. I knew your uncle a bit. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you." Emory moved through the store, picking items off shelves. Coffee, beans, flour, salt pork, matches, lantern oil. Basic supplies for someone planning to stay a while. Martha rang them up without comment. But when he pulled out the cash from the lawyer, clean 20s that felt wrong in his work-roughened hands, she spoke again. "That ranch is in rough shape. Everyone knows it. No judgment if you decide to sell and move on. I might fix it up first. See what it's worth." She bagged his supplies, then paused. "Your uncle was a complicated man, Mr. Tate. Folks here have long memories, and not all of them are kind. You're starting with a handicap, whether that's fair or not. Just be aware. What exactly do people remember?" Martha's eyes flicked toward the window, then back. "That Silas Tate came and went at odd hours. That he had friends who didn't stay long and didn't smile much. That money changed hands in ways nobody could quite track. But like I said, long memories. Could be half of its imagination." She pushed the bags across the counter. "You need anything else, you come see me. I don't traffic in gossip, just goods." Emory thanked her and carried his supplies outside. Across the street, a man in a sheriff's uniform stood, leaning against a patrol car, watching. The star on his chest caught the thin sunlight. Emory crossed over, bags in hand. "Sheriff Donovan?" "That's right." The sheriff was maybe 50, weather-beaten and solid, with a mustache that had gone gray. His eyes were cop's eyes, careful, evaluating. "You're the nephew, Emory Tate. I heard you were coming. Lawyer tell you about the property?" "Told me it needs work," Donovan nodded slowly. "Your uncle and I didn't exactly see eye to eye back in the day. Never proved anything, never charged him with anything, but I had my suspicions. Ancient history now, but I believe in being straight with people. You planning to stay?" "Haven't decided yet." "Fair enough. Just know I keep an eye on things in this county." Anything unusual happens out at that ranch, anything that doesn't sit right, I'll hear about it. And I'll come looking." Donovan's tone wasn't threatening exactly. "Just clear. Your uncle's past is his own. But you're starting fresh. See that it stays that way. I'm 60 years old, Sheriff. Too tired for trouble." "Good to hear." Donovan touched his hat and walked away, boots heavy on the sidewalk. Emory stood there in the cold, supplies weighing down his arms, and felt the town's judgment settle on his shoulders like snow. These people didn't know him, didn't know he'd lived clean and worked honest his whole life. All they saw was the name Tate and whatever shadows his uncle had cast. It made something old and familiar stir in his chest, that feeling of not belonging, of always being on the outside looking in. He'd lived with it so long it didn't even hurt anymore. It was just there, like a scar you stopped noticing. He walked to the livery at the edge of town, where he'd stabled Maudie. The donkey was in a clean stall, contentedly chewing hay. She was 8 years old, grey as smoke, with a white patch on her nose and eyes that held more sense than most people Emory knew. He'd found her 5 years back at a livestock auction, bound for slaughter because her previous owner said she was too stubborn. Emory had paid $40 for her, and she'd been with him ever since, more reliable than any friend he'd ever had. "Time to see our new home, girl," he said, scratching behind her ears. The livery owner helped him load his supplies and gave directions to the ranch. "Follow the county road north 15 miles, then look for the turnoff marked by a lightning-split cottonwood. After that, it's rough going. Old logging road, mostly overgrown. You sure about this?" "Sure as I've ever been about anything." The ride out took 3 hours. Maudie plodded along with her characteristic stubbornness, unbothered by the cold or the lengthening shadows. The county road was paved for the first 10 miles, then turned to graded dirt. Mountains rose on all sides, pine-covered and severe. The air smelled of snow coming and wood smoke from distant cabins. Emory saw the split cottonwood, exactly where the livery owner said it would be. A massive old tree struck by lightning. So long ago the scar had weathered smooth. The turnoff was barely visible, 2 ruts through brown grass and sage. Maudie picked her way carefully, ears forward. The track climbed and wound through scrub pine, crossed a frozen creek, and emerged into a clearing as the sun touched the mountain peaks. And there it was, Uncle Silas's ranch. The cabin sat in the middle of the clearing, built from split logs chinked with what looked like mud and moss. Single story, maybe 20 feet by 30, with a stone chimney at one end. Half the windows were broken, stuffed with rags or cardboard. The roof sagged in the middle, and the front porch had collapsed entirely on one side. Behind it, the barn was a skeleton, frames still standing, but walls mostly gone, roof caved in. Everywhere Emory looked, he saw neglect and the patient work of weather and time. But there was beauty, too. The clearing was ringed by pine and aspen, and a small creek ran along the northern edge, its water clear and cold. The land rolled away to the south, open meadow that would be green come spring. Mountains stood watch on 3 sides, close enough to feel protective, but far enough to leave sky. In summer, this place would be paradise. In winter, it would be brutal. Emory dismounted and stood there as the last light drained from the sky. Maudie nuzzled his shoulder, patient. He'd expected to feel disappointment, maybe even anger at inheriting a ruin. But what he felt instead surprised him, a strange, cautious hope. This place was broken, sure, but broken could be fixed. Broken could become something again. He tied Maudie to a porch post and pushed open the cabin door. Hinges screamed. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with the smell of mouse nests and dry rot. But the structure was solid. The floor didn't give under his weight. The stone hearth looked sound. A rough table and 2 chairs sat in the main room. Against one wall stood a narrow bed frame, its mattress long since claimed by mice. Shelves had been built into the walls, most of them empty now. Emory lit his lantern and the space came alive with shadows. He moved through slowly, taking inventory. A cast-iron stove in the corner, rusty but intact. A water pump at a dry sink. He'd have to see if it still worked. 2 smaller rooms off the main space, one with another bed frame, one completely empty. The floors were rough planks, uneven but thick. The walls were chinked tight enough to keep out most of the wind. On one of the shelves near the hearth, something caught the lantern light. Emory reached up and pulled down a leather-bound book, its cover soft with age and handling. He opened it carefully. Inside, written in a firm, neat hand, were dated entries. A journal. He read the first page by lantern light, standing in the cold cabin that was now his. May 4th, 1982. Ran the north route. 3 packages. No complications. The Brotherhood is pleased. Payment received in full. Emory turned pages slowly, scanning entries. They were brief, cryptic. Routes and deliveries and packages, names that meant nothing to him. Amounts of money that seemed too large to be legitimate. And again, references to the Brotherhood, his uncle's handwriting, clear and methodical. His uncle's secrets laid out in careful shorthand. Emory closed the journal and stood there in the darkness, feeling the weight of inherited mystery settle around him like the cold. Outside, Maudie shifted and snorted. The wind picked up, making the cabin creak and whisper. Emory set his bedroll on the floor near the hearth, built a small fire with wood he found stacked against the wall, and heated a can of beans over the flames. He ate slowly, the journal resting on his knee. Whatever his uncle had been, smuggler, criminal, outlaw, he'd lived here in this place. He'd walked these floors and looked out these windows and kept his secrets locked in his chest. And now those secrets were Emory's burden to carry, whether he wanted them or not. The fire crackled and settled. Emory read more entries by its light, trying to piece together a life he'd never been part of. His uncle had been careful, revealing just enough to remember, but not enough to condemn. A man who'd lived in shadows and learned to trust no one. Tomorrow he'd start repairs. He'd make this cabin livable, bring in more supplies, see if he could survive a Wyoming winter. But tonight, his first night on land he owned, Emory Tate sat in front of a fire and read his uncle's secrets, and wondered what else the old man had left behind. 3 days of hard work had turned the cabin from uninhabitable to merely rough. Emory had patched the broken windows with salvaged wood and canvas, swept out the accumulated debris of years, and got the water pump working again after priming it for an hour. The stove drew properly once he'd cleaned out the flue. He'd brought in firewood from the collapsed barn, stacking it against the wall where it could dry. The place still looked like it had been through a war, but at least it was his war now. He'd been reading the journal every night, trying to decode his uncle's cryptic entries. The more he read, the clearer it became that Silas Tate had been part of something organized and dangerous. The routes mentioned in the journal traced through wilderness areas across 3 states. The amounts of money involved were staggering, thousands of dollars per run, paid in cash. And always that reference to the Brotherhood, never explained, never elaborated. Just understood. On the morning of the 4th day, Emory was sweeping ash from the hearth when Maudie started acting strange. She'd been grazing peacefully in the clearing, hobbled loosely so she wouldn't wander. But now she came trotting up to the open cabin door, ears pricked forward, making that low snorting sound she made when something caught her attention. She pushed her nose against the doorframe and stepped inside. Something she'd never done before. "Hey now, you know better," Emory said. But Maudie ignored him. She walked straight to the hearth and began pawing at the stone floor with her front hoof. Not random scratching, focused, insistent pawing at one specific spot near the base of the hearth stonework. Emory watched her for a moment, amused despite himself. "What did you find, girl? Mouse hole?" But Maudie kept at it, pawing and snorting, her entire attention fixed on that single spot. Emory set down his broom and knelt beside her. The hearthstone was built solid, river rocks and mortar forming a raised platform that extended about 3 feet from the fireplace. He ran his hand over the stones where Maudie was pawing. They felt the same as all the others, cold, rough, ancient. "Nothing there, Maudie." "Just stones," she stamped harder, insistent. Her hoof struck one particular stone, and it shifted slightly, rocking back with a hollow sound. Emory's hand froze. That wasn't right. Hearthstones were mortared solid. They didn't rock. He pressed his fingers around the edges of the stone, feeling for gaps. There, a seam barely visible beneath decades of dust and soot. His heart started beating faster. He worked his fingers into the seam and pulled. The stone lifted free easily, revealing not mortar beneath, but metal. A brass plate tarnished green with age, but still solid. And set into that plate was a cunningly hidden latch, spring-loaded and disguised to look like nothing more than decorative metalwork. Emory sat back on his heels, staring at it. His uncle had built this, hidden it here in plain sight for God knew how many years. He reached out slowly and pressed the latch. It gave with a soft click, and a section of the floor beside the hearth dropped down an inch with a heavy thunk. Maudie stepped back, satisfied with herself, and ambled out of the cabin to resume grazing. Emory didn't move for a long moment. He could hear his own breathing, feel his pulse in his throat. Whatever was under this floor, his uncle had gone to considerable trouble to hide it, which meant it was either very valuable or very dangerous. Possibly both. He worked his fingers under the dropped section of floor and lifted. The planks came up as a single piece, revealing a shallow space, maybe 4 feet square and a foot deep. Inside sat a wooden crate, its lid sealed with tar to keep out moisture. Dust lay thick on its surface, undisturbed for years, maybe decades. Emory lifted the crate out. It was heavier than it looked, and set it on the floor. He found a screwdriver in his supply bag and pried at the tarred lid. It took some work, but finally the seal broke, and the lid came free with a groan of old wood. Inside lay his uncle's secrets. 6 leather pouches, each the size of a flour sack, were arranged in 2 rows. Emory opened the first one with shaking hands. Gold dust spilled across his palm, heavy and bright even in the dim cabin light. The second pouch held coins, double eagles mostly, gold pieces from the 1880s and 1920s. He didn't have to count them to know there were hundreds. The remaining pouches held more of the same, a fortune in gold that must have weighed 30 pounds or more. But there was more. Beneath the pouches lay a stack of hand-drawn maps, each one showing routes through mountain passes, creek crossings, landmark rocks. Names were penciled in: Broken Mesa, Copper Creek, Devil's Backbone, Whiskey Gap. Beside the maps was a ledger, similar to the journal he'd been reading but more detailed. Columns of names, dates, and dollar amounts. Records of transactions, deliveries, payments received. A smuggling operation laid out in meticulous detail. At the bottom of the crate was a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. 4 men stood in front of a wilderness tent, all of them armed with rifles, all of them staring at the camera with the hard confidence of men who lived outside the law. Emory recognized his uncle immediately. Younger, maybe 40 years old, lean and weather-beaten. The other 3 men were strangers. One was Mexican, with bandoliers crossed over his chest. Another was Native American, holding his rifle casually across his shoulders. The third was white, older than the others, with a scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw. Emory turned the photograph over. Written in pencil on the back were 4 names: Silas, Guerrero, 2 knives, Rake. He set the photograph down and stared at the fortune spread before him. $40,000. Maybe more if the gold was pure and the coins were authentic. More money than he'd earned in his entire 60 years of working. Money that could buy him a life he'd never dared imagine, a real home, security, comfort in his old age. Money that could change everything. But there was a weight to it that went beyond gold. This fortune had been earned in blood and shadows. It represented crimes committed, laws broken, people harmed or betrayed. It was his uncle's legacy, sure, but it was a dark legacy. Accepting it meant accepting everything that came with it. He picked up the ledger and flipped through its pages. The entries went back to 1975 and ran through 1989, 14 years of smuggling operations, carefully documented. And the last entry was dated 3 months before his uncle had moved to town and abandoned this place. It read simply, "Last run. The Brotherhood is finished. Everyone goes their own way. I'm done." So his uncle had gotten out, walked away from the life, hidden his fortune, and lived out his years as a quiet old man in a boarding house. Maybe he'd felt guilty. Maybe he'd just gotten tired. Either way, he'd left everything here, sealed under the floorboards of a cabin that was falling apart. trusting that someday someone would find it, trusting that Emory would find it. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Maudie grazed peacefully. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water, and Emory Tate sat on the floor of his uncle's cabin, surrounded by gold and maps and the evidence of a life lived in secret, and wondered what kind of man he was going to be. He'd spent 60 years drifting, taking the easy path, never committing to anything or anyone, never owning anything worth keeping. Now he had a choice. He could take this gold and disappear, start fresh somewhere nobody knew his name. Or he could stay here, work this land, and try to build something honest from his uncle's dishonest legacy. Or, and this thought scared him most, he could try to make it right somehow, figure out where the gold came from and who it rightfully belonged to. But who would he even tell? Sheriff Donovan would seize it all, maybe arrest him for hiding stolen property. The lawyer would get involved, tie it up in courts for years. The town would judge him even more harshly than they already did. And if any of his uncle's old partners were still alive, the men in that photograph, they might come looking for their share. Emory carefully repacked the crate, sealing the lid as best he could. He lowered it back into the hidden space and replaced the false floor, pressing until the latch clicked shut. The loose stone went back in place, fitting perfectly. You'd never know it was there unless you were looking, unless a stubborn donkey pawed at exactly the right spot. He stood up slowly, his knees aching. Through the window he could see the mountains, white-capped and eternal, watching over this little clearing like they'd watched over it for 10,000 years. They didn't care about gold or guilt or the choices one old man had to make. They just stood there, patient and indifferent. Emory picked up his uncle's journal from the table and sat down, turning to a page he'd read before but hadn't fully understood. The entry was dated June 1989, just before the last run. Some things can't be undone. Some debts can't be repaid. But maybe leaving something behind for the ones who come after is enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do. He closed the journal and sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the wind and the creak of old wood, and knew that whatever he decided, it would define the rest of his life. The fortune under the floorboards wasn't just gold. It was a question waiting to be answered, and he was the only one who could answer it. Dawn came cold and grey, but Emory hadn't slept enough to notice. He'd spent most of the night sitting at the table, turning a small object over in his hands. The pocket watch had been in the crate with the gold, tucked into a leather pouch of its own. Silver, tarnished almost black, with initials engraved on the back cover, St. Silas Tate. He pressed the stem, and the cover popped open. The face was yellowed but intact. The hands stopped at 3:47. Whether that was morning or afternoon, Emory had no way of knowing. The watch had stopped a long time ago, freezing that moment like an insect in amber. Inside the cover was an inscription, faint but readable. To Silas from M time, stand still for no man. Who was M? A woman, probably. A love his uncle had left behind, or who had left him. The watch felt like a metaphor Emory couldn't quite grasp. Time frozen at the moment his uncle had decided to hide his fortune and walk away from his past. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just a broken watch, nothing more. But he kept it anyway, sliding it into his jacket pocket where it rested against his chest like a second heartbeat. By the time full light arrived, Emory had made his decision. He would keep the gold secret for now. Not out of dishonesty, but out of caution. He needed time to think, to understand what he'd inherited before he did something he couldn't take back. The fortune had survived hidden for 35 years. It could survive hidden a while longer. He checked the false floor carefully, making sure everything was secure and invisible. Then he took only the journal and the watch, leaving the maps and ledger with the gold. If someone came looking, they'd find nothing. Just an old cabin and an aging drifter trying to make a go of his uncle's abandoned ranch. Around mid-morning, he saddled Maudie for the ride to town. The donkey seemed pleased to have purpose, stepping lively despite the cold. The track down to the county road was easier in daylight, and Emory found himself studying the landscape differently now. Every rock formation, every creek crossing, every stand of timber could be one of the landmarks on his uncle's maps. The wilderness that had seemed empty now felt full of hidden routes and secret passages, a network his uncle had known intimately. Cold water looked the same as it had 4 days ago. Quiet, weathered, suspicious. Emory tied Maudie outside Caldwell's general store and pushed through the door. The bell chimed, and Martha looked up from restocking shelves. Her expression softened when she saw him. "Back already? Thought the ranch might have scared you off." "Not yet," Emory said. He moved through the aisles, gathering supplies. Lumber for window repairs, proper roofing tar, nails, a new axe to replace his dull one. Work gloves, kerosene, canned goods to supplement his dwindling food stores. Martha rang up each item without comment, but when he pulled out cash to pay, she paused. "Place really that bad?" "It's manageable. I've seen worse. You planning to stay the winter?" Emory met her eyes. "Haven't decided yet, but I'm not one to leave a job half-finished." She nodded, accepting that. "Your uncle used to say the same thing. Man of few words, but when he committed to something, he saw it through." She bagged his supplies, then added quietly, "Folks talk, Mr. Tate. Can't help it in a town this size. But I don't repeat what I hear, and I don't judge a man by his kin. You need anything, you come see me." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Caldwell." "Martha, we're not formal here." He loaded his supplies and was securing them to Maudie's pack saddle when Sheriff Donovan's patrol car pulled up. The sheriff got out slowly, hitching his belt the way cops do, and walked over with measured steps. "Settling in out there?" "Working on it. Find anything interesting?" The question was casual, but Donovan's eyes were sharp. Lots of repairs needed. "Broken windows, sagging roof. Keeps me busy. I meant more in the way of your uncle's belongings. Personal effects, papers, that sort of thing." Emory kept his expression neutral. "Some old furniture. Not much else." Place was pretty well cleaned out. Donovan studied him for a long moment. "You know, I spent 20 years trying to figure out what your uncle was into. Never could prove a thing, but I knew, the way a lawman knows. He was running something through these mountains, and whatever it was, it made him money. More money than a simple rancher should have. Maybe he invested well. Maybe." Donovan's tone suggested he didn't believe that for a second. Or maybe he was smart enough to hide what he didn't want found. Either way, it's ancient history. But if something does turn up, something that raises questions, I'd advise you to come talk to me before you make any decisions. For your own sake. I appreciate the advice, Sheriff." Donovan touched his hat and walked back to his car. Emory watched him drive away, feeling the weight of the pocket watch against his chest. The sheriff suspected something. Maybe not specifically, but he had the instinct that comes from years of watching people lie. Emory would have to be very careful. The ride back to the ranch was slower, Maudie taking her time with the extra weight. Emory's mind turned over the conversation with Donovan, analyzing every word. The sheriff was warning him, but it was a friendly warning, or as friendly as a warning could be from a man who'd spent 2 decades trying to catch your uncle breaking the law. Back at the cabin, Emory unloaded supplies and got to work. He spent the afternoon replacing broken window glass, using the lumber he'd bought to frame in proper sashes. The work felt good, honest, productive, something he could see progress in. By evening, he had 3 windows fully repaired, and the cabin already felt warmer, more secure. After dark, he lit the lantern and spread one of the maps on the table. It showed a route that started at the ranch, wound north through what looked like wilderness, and ended at a place marked Broken Mesa with an X. Beside the X was a notation, EM1, emergency cache number 1 maybe. Emory traced the route with his finger. It passed through forest, crossed a creek at a narrow point, skirted a cliff face, and emerged at what the map indicated was a rocky outcrop. The whole route was maybe 15 miles, a day's journey on horseback or with a loaded mule. He pulled out the journal and found entries that referenced Broken Mesa. They were brief: BM run successful, BM cache restocked, but they suggested the place had been important to his uncle's operation. If there was another cache there, if his uncle had hidden more gold or supplies, it would change everything. The fortune under the cabin floor might be just the beginning, but it would be dangerous to go looking. If anyone saw him, if he was followed, if the sheriff decided to keep tabs on him, he could lead them right to more evidence. Or worse, to something illegal that would land him in jail for hiding it. Still, he needed to know. Needed to understand the full scope of what his uncle had been involved in. The watch in his pocket seemed to tick, though he knew it was stopped. Time stands still for no man. But maybe, for just a while, Emory could pause and figure out which direction time should move. He refolded the map and tucked it with the journal. Tomorrow he'd work on the roof. Maybe the day after, if he felt brave enough, he'd ride out to Broken Mesa, not to claim anything, just to see. Just to understand what kind of man his uncle had been, and what kind of man Emory himself needed to be now. A week passed in the rhythm of honest work. Emory patched the roof, secured the porch, and cleared enough of the barn debris to salvage usable lumber. The cabin was starting to feel less like a ruin and more like a home, even if it was a rough one. He'd strung a line for drying clothes, built a proper woodpile, and got the stove working well enough to bake bread. Small victories, but they added up. He was working in the barn, moving aside collapsed beams when he found the spurs. They lay half-buried in dirt and rotted hay. A pair of riding spurs, so rusted they looked like they'd been forged from oxidized iron. But when Emory cleaned them off with a rag, he could see they'd once been fine pieces. Silver inlay work, still visible beneath the rust, rowels that spun freely despite their age. What caught his attention were the notches carved into each spur's shank. 7 marks on each side, deep and deliberate, cut with a knife blade. Emory counted them twice to be sure. 7, like counting coup or marking successful runs. He turned the spurs over in his hands, imagining his uncle wearing them, riding through mountain passes with contraband loaded on pack mules, carving a notch each time he made it through safely. 7 times, maybe 7 years, or 7 particularly dangerous runs. No way to know for certain. But the spurs felt significant in a way he couldn't quite explain, like they were waiting for him to pick up where his uncle had left off. Not smuggling, God no, but riding the routes, learning the territory, understanding what Silas had known. The spurs were an invitation or maybe a challenge. That evening, Emory made his decision. He'd ride to Broken Mesa. He left before dawn, packing light, water, dried meat, the map, his rifle. Maudie seemed to sense this was different from their usual trips to town. She stepped carefully but with purpose, ears forward, alert to the wilderness opening before them. The route followed an old game trail that climbed steadily through pine forest, the air cold and thin and scented with resin. By mid-morning they'd reached the creek crossing marked on the map. The water ran shallow over smooth stones, clear enough to see the bottom. Maudie drank deeply while Emory refilled his canteen. The silence out here was complete. No birds, no wind, just the sound of running water and Maudie's breathing. It felt like stepping back in time, into a wilderness that hadn't changed in 100 years. The trail climbed higher, skirting a cliff face where the rock was striated in reds and greys. Emory found himself watching for signs of previous passage. Disturbed rocks, old fire rings, anything that suggested his uncle had come this way repeatedly. But the wilderness had erased most traces. Only the trail itself remained, worn smooth by generations of deer and elk and the occasional human traveler. They reached Broken Mesa by early afternoon. The rocky outcrop rose like a ship's prow from the surrounding pine forest, its face weathered and cracked. At its base, partially hidden by scrub oak, was the mouth of a cave. Not deep, maybe 20 feet, but sheltered from weather and invisible unless you knew where to look. Emory dismounted and approached cautiously. Inside, the cave floor was dry and sandy. The walls showed smoke stains from old fires. Someone had used this place regularly, and recently enough that the fire rings still held charcoal. He moved deeper, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Against the back wall, covered with flat stones, was a cache. His heart hammered as he moved the stones aside. Beneath them sat 3 rusted tin boxes, the kind that once held tobacco or crackers. He opened the first one. Inside were gold coins, maybe 30 of them wrapped in oilcloth. The second box held paper money, hundreds and fifties, old bills from the 80s, still crisp and negotiable. The third contained a folded piece of paper. Emory unfolded it carefully. His uncle's handwriting, unmistakable now, after reading the journal for days, for emergencies. Trust no one but family. BM1, CC2, WG3, DB4. The routes, remember. 4 caches. BM was Broken Mesa, clearly. CC might be Copper Creek. WG could be Whiskey Gap. DB was Devil's Backbone. All locations marked on the maps back at the cabin. His uncle had left money and supplies along the entire smuggling network. Insurance against disaster or betrayal. And now they all belonged to Emory. He sat back on his heels, trying to calculate. If each cache held this much, the total fortune might be twice what he'd found under the cabin floor. Maybe more. His uncle hadn't just been careful. He'd been paranoid, spreading his wealth across the wilderness where no bank or lawman could seize it, where only family could find it if they knew where to look. Emory resealed the tin boxes and covered them with stones again. He'd leave them for now. Coming back with pack animals to retrieve them all would take planning, and he still wasn't sure what he wanted to do with any of it. The note said, "Trust no one but family," but Emory was the last of the family. There was no one left to trust. He emerged from the cave into bright afternoon sunlight. Maudie was grazing contentedly nearby. The wilderness stretched away in all directions, pine and rock and sky, beautiful and indifferent. Emory filled his lungs with cold air and tried to settle his racing thoughts. That's when he saw the rider. Far below, maybe a mile back along the trail, a figure on horseback stood motionless at the edge of the tree line. Too far to make out details, but close enough to know he was being watched. Emory felt his stomach tighten. How long had the rider been there? Had he followed Emory from the ranch? Or was it coincidence, just another traveler in the wilderness? The rider didn't move, didn't approach or retreat, just watched. Emory forced himself to turn away casually, as if he hadn't noticed. He mounted Maudie and started back down the trail, taking a different route than he'd come up, a longer path that would let him see if he was being followed. His mind raced through possibilities. Sheriff Donovan keeping tabs on him? One of his uncle's old partners, checking if anyone had found the caches? A random stranger who just happened to be in the wrong place? The ride back took 4 hours, and twice Emory thought he glimpsed movement behind him. A flash of color between trees, the sound of hooves on rock. But when he stopped and looked, there was nothing. Just wilderness and wind and his own imagination running wild. He reached the ranch as the sun set, painting the clearing in shades of gold and purple. Everything looked undisturbed. The cabin door was still latched. No fresh tracks in the dirt except his own from the morning. He unsaddled Maudie and checked the false floor, still secure, still hidden, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Someone knew he was here. Someone was watching. Whether they knew about the gold or were just curious about Silas Tate's nephew, Emory couldn't say. But the isolation he'd felt when he first arrived, that sense of being alone in the wilderness, was gone. He was being hunted, or evaluated, or tested. The spurs sat on the table where he'd left them, 7 notches gleaming dully in the lantern light. 7 successful runs. But how many failures had there been? How many times had his uncle been followed, threatened, nearly caught? And what had happened to Guerrero, 2 Knives and Rake, the other men in the photograph? Emory pulled out the journal and the photograph, studying the 4 faces. Hard men, dangerous men, men who'd lived by their wits and their guns. His uncle had survived and walked away. But the others, where were they now? Dead in prison? Or still out there, waiting to see who would come looking for Silas Tate's hidden fortune? Tomorrow he'd stay close to the ranch, work on repairs, act like nothing had happened, but he'd keep his rifle loaded. And he'd watch the tree line for riders who appeared and vanished like ghosts. The next 3 days, Emory worked within sight of the cabin, never venturing far, always aware of the tree line. He repaired the barn's frame, hauled water, split firewood. Normal ranch work. But his rifle leaned against the cabin door, and his eyes swept the clearing every few minutes, searching for movement that didn't belong. No riders appeared. No tracks showed up that shouldn't be there. The wilderness remained empty and indifferent. But the feeling of being watched persisted, a weight between his shoulder blades that never quite lifted. On the fourth evening, while organizing some of Uncle Silas's belongings from a trunk he'd found in the back room, Emory discovered another photograph. It had been tucked between the pages of an old almanac, protected from light and moisture. The image was clearer than the first. The same four men, but taken at a different time, in a different place. They stood in front of a trading post, a rough wooden building with a sign too faded to read. But what caught Emory's attention was what was written on the back. The handwriting was different from his uncle's, shakier, more urgent. Silas, Rake can't be trusted. He's talking to Law. We need to disappear. Meet at the usual place or run. GG for Guerrero, the Mexican man with the bandoliers. A warning from 35 years ago, preserved in fading ink. Emory turned the photograph over, studying Rake's face, the white man with the scar. His expression in the picture was harder than the others, his eyes narrower. Or maybe that was just Emory reading intention into the image, now that he knew what had happened. So the Brotherhood had fallen apart because of betrayal. Rake had talked to law enforcement, or was going to. That's why Silas had hidden his fortune and vanished into retirement. Not guilt, or not just guilt. Fear, self-preservation. The smart move of a man who'd seen his partners turn on each other. Emory wondered what had happened to Rake. Had he actually testified? Was he in witness protection somewhere, living under a new name? Or had Guerrero and Two Knives solved the problem more permanently? The journal never mentioned Rake after 1989, just that cryptic final entry about the Brotherhood being finished and everyone going their own way. He was still studying the photograph when he heard Maudie sound her alarm, a sharp bray that she only made when strangers approached. Emory grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. A truck was coming up the track, old and battered, moving slowly over the rough ground. Not the sheriff's patrol car, not anyone from town he recognized. The truck stopped 50 yards from the cabin. A man got out, moving carefully, hands visible. He was old, maybe 75, Native American, lean and weathered as driftwood. He wore a denim jacket and a broad-brimmed hat, and he stood by his truck without approaching, waiting. Emory stepped out onto the porch, rifle held low but ready. "Help you?" "Emory Tate?" The man's voice carried clearly across the distance. "That's right, I knew your uncle. Worked with him years back. Name's Joseph Whitehorse. Folks called me Two Knives." The name hit Emory like cold water. Two Knives. One of the four men in the photographs. One of the Brotherhood. Still alive, still here, and now standing in Emory's clearing, with God knew what intentions. "What do you want?" Two Knives spread his hands, showing they were empty. "Just a talk. Been hearing you're asking questions, poking around places your uncle used to go. Figured we should have a conversation before things get complicated. I'm not asking questions. I'm fixing up a ranch. You rode to Broken Mesa 4 days ago. Spent an hour at the cave. That's more than fixing up a ranch." Two Knives' tone wasn't threatening, just matter of fact. "I live up the mountain. See most of what happens in this valley. When Silas's nephew shows up and starts following the old routes, that gets my attention." Emory lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't set it down. "You're the one who's been watching me, making sure you weren't bringing trouble. Silas was my friend. I owed him enough to check on his kin before deciding what to do about you." "And what did you decide?" Two Knives was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. "That you're not law, not cartel, not someone coming to settle old scores. You're just a man who inherited a mystery and doesn't quite know what to do with it." He gestured toward the cabin. "Mind if I come closer?" "Gets tiring yelling across the clearing." Emory hesitated, then nodded. Two Knives walked forward with the measured pace of a man who'd learned caution the hard way. He stopped at the base of the porch, looking up at Emory with eyes that were sharp despite his age. "Silas left you the ranch, which means he left you everything else too, whether he said it out loud or not. That fortune he hid is yours by right. I don't contest that. You knew about it, of course I knew. Helped him build some of those caches. The Brotherhood ran gold and goods through these mountains for 14 years. Made enough money that we could have retired rich if we'd been smart. But Rake got scared, started talking about cutting deals. So we split before the law came down on us. Silas took his share and disappeared. I went back to the reservation, lived quiet. Guerrero went to Mexico. And Rake, Two Knives, shook his head. Rake got what he deserved. The way he said it made Emory's stomach tighten. What does that mean? Means the kind of life we lived doesn't end peaceful unless you're very lucky and very careful. Silas was both. He knew when to walk away, and he had the discipline to stay away. Rake didn't. Two Knives met Emory's eyes. The past is finished. The Brotherhood is dead. No one's coming for that gold except you. But I'm here to tell you something important. If you take it, if you use it, you become part of the story. Silas's story. And that story has weight. What kind of weight? The kind that follows you. The kind that asks questions. People in town already looking at you sideways because of your name. You start spending gold coins from the 1880s, paying cash for things, living better than a ranch hand should. They'll notice. Sheriff will notice. And some questions don't have good answers. Emory leaned against the porch post, feeling the truth of that settle in his bones. So what would you do? Two Knives smiled faintly. I'd do what Silas should have done. I'd take enough to live on, bury the rest, and work this land honest. Build something real instead of spending something stolen. But that's just an old man talking. You're 60. Not much time left to be building anything. Maybe taking it all and running makes more sense at your age. I'm not running. No, Two Knives agreed, studying him. I don't think you are. You've got Silas's stubborn streak, I can see that. Which means you'll probably do something foolish and noble instead of something smart. He turned to go, then paused. One more thing. That map shows 4 caches. There's actually 5. Silas made one more after we split, kept it secret even from me. Don't know where it is. But if you find it, that's the clean money. Last honest work he did before retiring. Might ease your conscience to know there's some of it that's not stained. He walked back to his truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Emory stood on the porch long after the sound of the engine faded, the photograph still in his hand, the weight of choices pressing down like winter sky. Two Knives had given him permission and warning in equal measure. The gold was his, but taking it came with a price. And somewhere out there was another cache, one his uncle had hidden even from his partners. Clean money, earned honestly, or at least honestly enough to let an old man sleep at night. Emory went inside and laid the photograph on the table next to the first one. 4 men who'd lived outside the law, 3 of them dead or vanished, one of them trying to do something decent before the end. And now Emory, the inheritor, standing at the same crossroads his uncle had stood at 35 years ago. Tomorrow he'd ride to Copper Creek. See what was waiting there. Not because he wanted the money, but because he needed to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited. Knowledge first, decisions later. That's how careful men survived. That's how Silas had survived. And if Emory was going to make it through this with his soul intact, he needed to be at least as careful as his uncle had been. Copper Creek was a 2-day journey, according to the map. Emory set out at first light, with Maudie loaded with supplies for camping overnight. The route took them higher into the mountains, following game trails that wound through pine forests, so thick the ground stayed dark even at midday. Snow had started to fall in the high country. Not heavy yet, but enough to dust the trail white and make footing uncertain. By late afternoon of the first day, they'd reached a high meadow where a shepherd's cabin stood, half collapsed, but with enough roof remaining to offer shelter. Emory made camp there, building a small fire and heating beans and coffee, while Maudie grazed on the frozen grass. The silence was profound up here, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree limb under snow's weight. He pulled out the journal and read by firelight, finding references to Copper Creek scattered through entries from 1983 to 1988. The cache there had been used as a waypoint, a place to rest and resupply during longer runs. His uncle had written about the beauty of the place, unusual for the sparse journal entries. CC reminds me why I do this. Some places are worth protecting, even if the methods are questionable. What did that mean? Protecting from what? Development? Outsiders? Or was it more personal? Protecting a private sanctuary where a man living outside the law could find brief peace. Emory slept fitfully, the cold seeping through his bedroll despite the fire. He woke before dawn and rode out as soon as there was enough light to see the trail. Maudie picked her way carefully through patches of ice, patient as always. They reached Copper Creek by mid-morning. The creek itself ran through a narrow canyon, the water clear and fast despite the cold. Willow and aspen lined the banks, bare now but still graceful. The cache location marked on the map was a rock overhang near a bend in the creek, sheltered and difficult to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. Emory found it without trouble. The overhang was deep enough to stand in, the floor dry and covered with fine sand. Someone, his uncle probably, had built a low stone wall across the opening, disguising it as natural rockfall. Behind the wall, protected from weather and animals, sat a larger cache than the one at Broken Mesa. 3 crates this time, wooden and sealed with tar. Emory pried open the first and found it packed with gold coins wrapped in cloth. The second held cash, stacks of bills bound with rubber bands, still crisp and viable. The third contained something unexpected. Personal effects, a hand-carved wooden box sat atop a folded wool blanket. Emory lifted it out carefully. The box was beautiful, despite its simplicity, made from cedar and fitted with brass hinges. Someone had spent hours carving designs into the lid, geometric patterns that looked Native American in origin, interspersed with mountain landscapes. The craftsmanship was remarkable, the kind of detail work that spoke of patience and genuine skill. He opened the box. Inside were letters, maybe 20 of them, tied with a faded ribbon. Emory unfolded the first one carefully, mindful of the brittle paper. "My dearest Silas," it began. "3 months have passed since you left, and I find myself counting days like a schoolgirl. I know the work you do is dangerous, and I know you can't speak of it. But I also know that you're trying to build something for us, for the future we've talked about. I trust you. I wait for you. Come back to me safe. All my love, Margaret M., the woman who'd given him the pocket watch." Emory's hands trembled as he read through more letters, each one a window into a relationship he'd never known his uncle had. Margaret wrote about teaching at a school in a town called Laurel Springs. She wrote about saving money, planning a life together, dreaming of a home where Silas could quit the work and they could live peaceful. The letters spanned from 1982 to 1987, growing more desperate as time went on. The last letter was different. Shorter, colder. "Silas, I can't do this anymore. 5 years I've waited, while you ride off into the mountains, doing things you won't explain. 5 years I've told myself it's for us, for our future. But I don't think you're ever coming back. Not really. I think you love the danger more than you love me. I've accepted a teaching position in Oregon. I'm leaving next week. If you truly want a life together, you know where to find me. But I won't wait anymore. I deserve more than being loved second best." Emory sat back, the letter still in his hands. His uncle had loved someone, had planned a life beyond the brotherhood, beyond the smuggling and the danger. But he'd waited too long, stayed in the life too long, and lost her. The box with its careful carvings, that had been for her. A gift he'd never given. Love that had nowhere to go, except into wood and waiting. He understood now why the journal entries about Copper Creek were different. This hadn't just been a waypoint. It had been a dreaming place, somewhere Silas came to remember what he was working toward. Until Margaret stopped waiting, and the dream died. Beneath the letters was a small leather notebook, newer than the journal back at the cabin. Emory opened it and found lists written in his uncle's hand. Itemized expenses, money sent to various charities, donations made anonymously to schools and churches. The amounts were substantial, thousands of dollars spread across years. At the bottom of the last page, a single line in different ink tried to balance the books. Some debts can't be repaid in gold, so his uncle had tried to make amends, tried to do good with money earned badly. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it complicated the picture. Silas Tate wasn't just a smuggler and an outlaw. He was a man who'd loved and lost, who'd tried in his flawed way to make things right, Emory resealed the box and placed it back in the crate. He wouldn't take the letters or the notebook. They belonged here, in this place that had meant something to his uncle. But he'd remember them. They changed how he thought about the fortune hidden under the cabin floor. It wasn't just stolen money anymore. It was opportunity lost, love abandoned, a life that could have been but wasn't. The ride back to the ranch took a full day, and Emory pushed through without stopping to camp. He needed to be back, needed to sit in the cabin and think. The snow fell harder as evening came, and by the time he reached the clearing, everything was covered in white. The cabin looked almost beautiful under its blanket of snow, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left a fire banked. No, wait. He hadn't left a fire. Someone was inside. Emory dismounted slowly, reaching for his rifle. The cabin door opened, and a woman stepped out, maybe 50 years old, with grey streaked brown hair and a practical wool coat. She raised her hands, showing they were empty. "Mr. Tate, I'm not here to cause trouble. My name is Sarah Cross. I'm Wendell Cross's daughter, the lawyer who handled your inheritance. We need to talk about your uncle, and we need to talk now. Because what you've inherited isn't just land and gold. You've inherited a debt that's about to come due." The snow fell between them, steady and silent. As Emory stood frozen between his donkey and the woman who'd been waiting in his cabin, and wondered how much worse things were about to get, Emory kept his rifle pointed at the ground, but didn't set it down. "You broke into my cabin. The door was unlocked, and I've been waiting 3 hours in the cold. I took the liberty of starting a fire. I apologize for the intrusion, but this couldn't wait." Sarah Cross moved back toward the doorway, but didn't go inside. "Please, 5 minutes of your time. After that, if you want me gone, I'll leave and never bother you again." Something in her tone, exhaustion maybe, or genuine desperation, made Emory nod. He tied Maudie near the water trough and followed Sarah inside, rifle still in hand. The cabin was warm, the fire built up properly, and she'd set a kettle on the stove. 2 tin cups sat on the table beside a leather folder thick with papers. "My father didn't tell you everything," Sarah said without preamble. "He couldn't. Legal privilege, and, well, he wasn't sure you'd stay. Most people would have looked at this place and run. But you didn't, which means I have to tell you the rest." "The rest of what?" Sarah opened the folder and pulled out a document, yellowed with age, but still legible. "In 1988, your Uncle Silas entered into a binding legal agreement with the Northern Cheyenne Nation. Specifically, with a council of elders who were trying to protect ancestral lands from development. You know about the gold your uncle was running?" Emory's silence was answer enough. "Of course you know. You've been riding the routes, checking the caches. I have eyes too, Mr. Tate, and not much happens in these mountains that doesn't get noticed." She pushed the document across the table. "The gold Silas was running wasn't stolen goods." "Well, not exactly. It was recovered gold. Pieces taken from sacred sites that had been desecrated by mining operations in the 1920s and 30s. Silas and the Brotherhood were repatriating it, moving it back through the mountains to be returned to the tribes or held in trust." Emory picked up the document, scanning the legal language. It was dense and formal, but the core was clear. Silas Tate agreed to hold certain properties and assets in trust, to be used only for the protection of designated lands and the support of tribal cultural preservation. In exchange, he would receive legal protection from prosecution for his past activities. "This can't be real," Emory said. "My uncle was a smuggler. Your uncle was a complicated man who made a deal with people who needed help." Sarah poured hot water into both cups, dropped tea bags in. "The Brotherhood started as criminals, yes, running stolen goods, moving contraband. But around 1985, they were approached by tribal elders who'd learned about their routes through the mountains, routes that passed through sacred lands the government had sold to developers. The elders offered them a different kind of work: recover sacred objects and gold that had been taken from burial sites and holy places, return it to where it belonged, and Silas agreed. All of them did at first. It was lucrative, and it carried less risk than their previous work. The tribes provided legal cover through sovereignty laws, but Rake didn't like the change. He wanted to go back to running drugs and guns. When the others refused, he threatened to expose everything. That's when the brotherhood fell apart. Emory sat down heavily, his mind reeling. So the gold under my cabin belongs to the Northern Cheyenne Nation, or it did. The agreement states that upon Silas's death, the assets held in trust transfer to his named heir, you, along with the obligation to fulfill the original terms. Sarah's eyes were steady, unflinching. That ranch you inherited, it's not just land. It's the center point of a protected corridor the tribes use for ceremonies and passage. The caches your uncle built along the routes, they're emergency supplies for people moving through traditional lands. The gold, that's the funding mechanism for buying back parcels as they become available. Why didn't the lawyer tell me this? Because my father doesn't know all of it. Silas never told him about the gold, only about the land trust. I only know because my mother was Northern Cheyenne. She was part of the original council that approached the Brotherhood. Before she died, she told me the truth about what Silas was trying to protect. Emory stared at the document. At the bottom was his uncle's signature, bold and clear, dated October 1988. Beside it were marks and signatures from tribal elders, witnessed and notarized. It was legal, binding, and now it was his responsibility. What happens if I refuse? If I just sell the land and keep the gold? Sarah's expression hardened. Then you break a sacred trust, and everything Silas worked to protect gets destroyed. There's a development company, Pinnacle Resources, that's been trying to buy land in this valley for 10 years. They want to put in a resort, luxury cabins, maybe a ski area. They've been patient, buying up parcels one by one. Your ranch is the keystone property. Without it, the corridor breaks, and everything Silas protected becomes vulnerable. How much time do I have? Pinnacle's made an offer through the county. Formal purchase proposal for 3 times market value. They need an answer within 30 days, or they'll move to eminent domain proceedings, claim public benefit. That was filed 2 weeks ago. You've got 16 days to decide. Emory stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered clearing. 16 days to decide between financial security and honoring a promise he didn't make, protecting land for people he didn't know. The weight of it was crushing. What did Silas intend to do? He intended to die peacefully in town and let you figure it out. He told my mother that if you inherited, you'd either be worthy of the trust or you wouldn't, that it wasn't his place to force you. But he hoped, Sarah's voice softened, he hoped you'd understand, that you'd see what he saw in this land and these people. And if I can't pay off the developers, if I don't have enough money, the gold in the caches, properly managed, is worth close to $200,000. Maybe more. That's enough to buy time, purchase key parcels, establish legal protections. But it requires keeping the trust intact. Using the money the way Silas intended. Emory turned back to face her. You said there were 4 caches on the maps. 2 Knives told me there's a 5th. Sarah nodded slowly. The clean cache. Money Silas earned legitimately in his last years, doing guide work and wilderness consultation. He kept it separate, so there'd be no question about its source. That money, about $50,000, is yours free and clear. No obligations. You could take it and walk away, let everything else fall apart. Where is it?
I don't know.
Silas never told my mother. He said when the right person came looking, they'd find it. Or they wouldn't, and that would be answer enough. The cabin was quiet except for the crack and settle of the fire. Outside, snow continued to fall, steady and inexorable. Emory felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff in a whiteout, unable to see the ground or the sky, just the immediate step in front of him. These tribal elders, he said finally. They know I'm here? They know. They're waiting to see what kind of man you are. And 2 Knives? He's part of this. He's an observer. Not officially, but the council trusts his judgment. If he'd decided you were wrong for this, you'd have had a different conversation with him. Or maybe no conversation at all. Emory sat back down, pulled the document closer, and read through it carefully. The legal language was clear. He'd inherited not just property, but purpose. His uncle's last act wasn't leaving him money, it was leaving him a choice. Be the kind of man who honors promises and protects what matters, or be the kind who takes the easy path and lives with the consequences. I need time to think. You have 16 days. After that, Pinnacle's lawyers start proceedings, and everything gets complicated in ways that can't be undone. Sarah stood, buttoning her coat. My mother believed Silas was a good man who'd made bad choices and spent his last years trying to make amends. She hoped his nephew would be better, would make the right choice the first time. I'll be in town if you need to talk. She left quietly, closing the door behind her. Emory sat in the warm cabin, the legal document before him, and felt the weight of inherited obligation settle onto his shoulders like snow. Outside, Maudie brayed softly, and the wind picked up, making the trees creak and whisper. 16 days. One choice. And a fortune in gold that wasn't really his at all. He pulled out his uncle's journal and reread the last entry. Some things can't be undone. Some debts can't be repaid. But maybe leaving something behind for the ones who come after is enough. Now he understood. The gold wasn't treasure. It was inheritance. Not of wealth, but of responsibility. And Emory Tate, 60 years old and tired, had to decide if he was ready to carry it. For 3 days, Emory barely slept. He read and reread the legal document, studied the maps until he could see the roots behind his closed eyes, and thought about what kind of man he wanted to be in the time he had left. The snow kept falling, covering the clearing in silence and white, giving him space to think without interruption. On the 4th morning, 2 knives appeared again, this time on foot, walking up the track through knee-deep snow. Emory saw him coming from the window and had coffee ready when the old man reached the porch. "You've been talking to Sarah Cross," 2 Knives said. Accepting the cup with a nod of thanks, she told me about the agreement, about what Silas was really doing. And I don't know if I'm the man for this. I've spent 60 years drifting, never stuck with anything, never built anything that mattered. 2 Knives sipped his coffee, studying Emory with those sharp eyes. Silas drifted too before he found purpose. Took him 50 years to figure out what mattered. You're 10 years ahead of schedule. Despite himself, Emory almost smiled. Sarah said there's a 5th cache. Clean money. You know where it is. I know where Silas was headed the last time I saw him, year before he died. He rode out with a pack mule. Said he had one more thing to take care of. Wouldn't tell me what. Came back 3 days later without the mule, looking satisfied. I figure he was hiding that last cache somewhere remote, somewhere only someone persistent would find. That doesn't narrow it down much. No, 2 Knives agreed. But I remember he came back from the north. High country towards Standing Rock Canyon, that sacred ground, ceremonial site for the old ones. If Silas wanted to hide something in a place that mattered, that's where he'd go. Emory pulled out the maps and spread them on the table. Standing Rock Canyon wasn't marked on any of them. How do I get there? 3-day journey, and you'd need to leave soon. Weather's turning. Another week and the high trails will be impossible until spring. 2 Knives traced a route with his finger. But before you go, there's people you should meet. The council elders. They've been patient, but they need to know your intentions. I haven't decided. Then decide by seeing what you'd be protecting. That afternoon, Emory rode to town with 2 Knives in the old man's truck. They drove north past Coldwater, through reservation land that looked like all the other Wyoming wilderness, until 2 Knives pointed out the subtle markers. Certain rocks, certain trees, the way the land shaped itself into natural gathering places. He stopped at a cluster of houses and a ceremonial roundhouse. Simple structures that looked temporary, but probably predated most of the towns in the county. Inside the roundhouse, 5 elders waited around a fire pit. 3 men, 2 women, all of them old enough that Emory couldn't guess their ages. They nodded as he entered, but didn't speak immediately. 2 Knives made introductions in a language Emory didn't understand, then gestured for Emory to sit. The eldest woman, her hair white as the snow outside, spoke in clear but accented English. "Silas Tate was our friend. He made mistakes in his youth, but he spent his later years making amends. You are his blood. We honor that. But blood alone does not make a man worthy of trust. I understand, Emory said. Do you? Another elder, a man with a deeply lined face, leaned forward. The land you inherited is the backbone of a corridor our people have used for 300 years. Before that, our ancestors used it for 3,000 more. It is not just land, it is memory. It is connection. When developers come with money and promises, they see only resources to extract. They do not see what will be lost, the first woman continued. Silas understood this. He agreed to hold the land in trust, not because we paid him, but because he saw what we saw. The mountains are not property. They are living beings. The gold he moved was not treasure. It was stolen pieces of our ancestors being returned. He gave us back what was taken. She reached into a leather bag beside her and pulled out a bundle wrapped in deerskin. She placed it on the ground before Emory. This is yours now. If you accept the trust. Emory unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside was a medicine bundle, sacred objects wrapped with careful attention. Eagle feathers, river stones painted with symbols, a small carved figure of a bear, dried herbs that filled the air with cedar scent. At the center was a piece of gold, roughly shaped, with markings that might have been ancient or might have been damaged from its recovery. That gold came from a burial site desecrated in 1927, the woman said. It was part of a burial mask, meant to guide a chief to the next world. Silas recovered it from a private collection in Denver, returned it to us. We kept one piece to remember, to show those who come after that some things can be made right. Emory stared at the bundle, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. This wasn't about money. It had never been about money. It was about restoring what had been broken, protecting what remained, honoring connections that went deeper than law or property. The developers, he said quietly. They know about the corridor. They know there are ceremonial sites. They've offered to preserve them as tourist attractions. Glass walkways and interpretive signs. The elder's voice carried bitter humor. They do not understand that making something accessible to everyone makes it sacred to no one. Another elder spoke, younger, maybe 60. Pinnacle Resources has money and lawyers. They will say they're creating jobs, bringing prosperity. The county commissioners will listen because towns here are dying, young people leaving. Your ranch is the last piece they need. Without it, the development can't proceed. With it, everything changes. 16 days, Emory said. 16 days, the elder confirmed. After that, they move to eminent domain. Claim public benefit. They might win. They might not. But the fight itself will damage the land, bring attention, turn the corridor into a battleground. Silas's hope was that his heir would simply say no, refuse to sell. Hold the line. The white-haired woman reached out and touched the medicine bundle. We do not ask you to be Silas. We ask you to be Emory Tate, who must decide what his life means. You have lived 60 years without purpose. This is your chance to find it. Or walk away and spend your remaining years knowing you chose comfort over courage. The words hit harder than any accusation could have. Emory carefully rewrapped the bundle and held it in his lap. If I refuse to sell, what happens? Pinnacle will pressure you. Offer more money. When you still refuse, they will investigate you. They will find reasons to question your ownership, your right to the land. They will make your life difficult. Two Knives spoke for the first time. But you won't be alone. The council has resources, legal experts, people who know how to fight these battles. Silas made the agreement so you wouldn't have to face this alone. And if they find the gold, the elders exchanged glances. The white-haired woman answered, then we tell the truth, that it's repatriated cultural property held in trust under tribal sovereignty. It's complicated legally, but it's defensible. What matters is your intent. Are you protecting it for the right reasons, or are you hoarding stolen wealth? Emory stood, still holding the bundle. I need to find the fifth cache. I need to know everything before I decide. The clean money, the woman said, nodding. Silas was proud of that. Said it was the first money he'd earned that he could spend without shame. If you find it, that tells us you're serious, that you're willing to do the work. Two Knives drove him back to the ranch as evening fell. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clearing, stars beginning to emerge in that brilliant way they do in mountain country. At the ranch, 2 knives helped Emory pack supplies for the journey to Standing Rock Canyon. "You'll need to leave at first light," the old man said. "Weather windows closing. 3 days up, 1 day to search, 3 days back. You've got maybe 8 days before the next storm hits. That leaves less than a week to deal with Pinnacle. Then you'd better be quick." 2 knives paused at his truck. "Silas asked me once why I stayed with the Brotherhood after Rake betrayed us. I told him it was because some things are worth the risk. Some things matter more than safety. I think he finally understood that in his last years. I hope you understand it sooner." After 2 knives left, Emory sat at the table with the medicine bundle before him. He unwrapped it again, studying each object. The eagle feathers for courage and vision, the painted stones for connection to earth and water, the bear figure for strength and protection, and the piece of gold, tarnished and rough, that had been torn from its sacred purpose and then restored. He thought about Margaret's letters at Copper Creek, about the pocket watch stopped at 347, about his uncle spending his last years trying to balance books that couldn't really be balanced. Silas had failed at love, succeeded at crime, and found redemption in protecting something larger than himself. Now that burden was Emory's. He packed carefully for the journey: food, rope, bedroll, his rifle, the maps. He would find the 5th cache. He would understand the full scope of what his uncle had built, and then he would decide whether he was strong enough to protect it. Outside, Maudie waited patiently, as she always did. Emory scratched her ears and whispered, "One more trip, girl. Then we'll know." The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and eternal. Somewhere in the high country, hidden in a place sacred and remote, his uncle's final gift was waiting. Not just money, purpose. The thing Emory had been searching for his whole life without knowing it had a name. The journey to Standing Rock Canyon tested everything Emory thought he knew about endurance. The trail climbed through pine forests so dense they blocked the sun, crossed frozen creeks where one misstep would mean a fall into ice water, and switchbacked up slopes so steep that Maudie had to stop every 100 yards to catch her breath. The temperature dropped steadily as they gained elevation, and by the second night, frost covered everything by sunset. Emory camped in a rocky overhang, building a small fire for warmth but not comfort. His hands ached from the cold, his knees protested every step, and he wondered more than once if he was too old for this kind of journey. But Maudie pressed on with patient determination, and he couldn't quit when she wouldn't. On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached Standing Rock Canyon. The place was aptly named, a narrow gorge carved through granite, with massive boulders balanced along its rim like sentinels. Some of the rocks bore ancient markings, symbols worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. The air felt different here, charged somehow, like walking into a church or standing at a grave. Sacred ground. Emory felt it in his bones. He spent hours searching, looking for signs of his uncle's passage. The canyon was remote enough that few people came here, and the evidence of human presence was minimal. A few fire rings, long cold, some broken pottery half buried in sand. But near the canyon's far end, where a spring emerged from the rock face, Emory found what he was looking for: a cairn. Stones stacked deliberately, forming a marker that looked natural, unless you knew what to look for. Emory dismounted and approached carefully, respectfully. This was his uncle's final cache, the clean money, hidden in a place that required commitment to reach. He dismantled the cairn stone by stone. Beneath it, sealed in a metal ammunition box and wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather bag. Emory lifted it out and felt the weight, substantial, but not just coins. He carried it to a flat rock near the spring and opened it. Inside were stacks of bills, 50s and 100s bound with rubber bands. Newer money than the bills in the other caches, earned in the late 80s and early 90s. He counted quickly. $48,000. More than Sarah had estimated. More than enough for a fresh start somewhere else, if that's what he wanted. But beneath the money was an envelope, sealed with wax. Emory's name was written on it in his uncle's handwriting. His hands shook as he broke the seal and pulled out a letter. 2 pages written in the same neat script as the journal. Emory, if you're reading this, you've proven yourself worthy already. Most men would have taken the easy path. You chose the hard one, and that tells me everything I need to know about your character. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to explain in person. Sorry for the burden I'm leaving you. But I'm not sorry for what I tried to protect. This money is yours, free and clear. I earned it honestly, guiding hunters and doing wilderness consultation in my last years before age made the work impossible. No blood on it, no stolen goods. Use it however you want. Walk away and live comfortable. I won't judge you from whatever comes after this life, but if you're reading this letter, I think you've already seen what I saw. The land is worth more than money. The connections between past and future matter more than personal comfort. I spent too many years chasing wealth and missed what was valuable until it was too late. Don't make my mistake. Margaret was right about me. I loved the danger more than I loved her. By the time I understood that, she was gone. The watch I left with the first cash, that's the moment I realized what I'd lost. 3:47 in the afternoon, standing in that cabin, holding a telegram saying she'd married someone else. Time stopped for me then. The rest was just working to make amends. You're 60 now, same age I was when I finally woke up. You've got time left to build something meaningful. The ranch, the trust, the covenant with the tribal council, that's your chance. Take it or leave it, but don't spend your last years wondering what might have been. I did that. It's a bitter way to die. 2 knives will help if you ask. Sarah Cross will help. The elders will welcome you if you're sincere. You won't be alone unless you choose to be. That's more than I had when I started. I loved you when you were 12, that summer I visited. There's something in you, a good heart, a straight spine. Your mother raised you right. I hope this inheritance gives you what I never gave myself, a chance to be better than I was. Uncle Silas. Emory read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. The money sat beside him, more cash than he'd ever held at once. Freedom, security, or obligation and purpose. The choice was still his. He looked around the canyon, at the ancient rocks and the sacred symbols, at Maudie grazing peacefully near the spring. The silence was profound, broken only by water trickling over stone and the wind moving through the gorge. This place had stood for millennia. Would stand for millennia more if men like him had the courage to protect it. Emory Tate, 60 years old and tired, made his decision. Emory returned to find his ranch had visitors. 2 SUVs were parked in the clearing, expensive vehicles that had no business on rough mountain tracks. 3 men in business casual stood on his porch waiting. One of them, tall and polished, with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted, stepped forward as Emory dismounted. "Mr. Tate, I'm Richard Brennan, Senior Acquisitions Director for Pinnacle Resources. We've been trying to reach you. I've been traveling." "Yes, well, time is of the essence. We've made a very generous offer for your property, far above market value. I'm here to finalize the paperwork." Brennan gestured to a briefcase one of his colleagues held. "We can have this settled today. You could be on your way with a check for $900,000 within the hour. 900,000. Triple what Sarah had mentioned. They were desperate, and desperation made them aggressive. Emory took his time unsaddling Maudie, letting the silence stretch. "Mr. Tate, did you hear me? $900,000. I heard you. Then surely you understand this is an opportunity you can't refuse. This ranch is worth maybe $300,000 on a good day. We're offering 3 times that." Emory finished with Maudie and turned to face Brennan. "I'm not selling." Brennan's smile tightened. "I don't think you understand the situation. We've already filed for eminent domain proceedings. The county commissioners are sympathetic to our development plans. This valley needs economic growth, and our resort will provide jobs, tax revenue, infrastructure. Your refusal isn't just stubborn, it's selfish. Maybe, but it's my property, and I'm keeping it." One of the other men stepped forward, younger, with the aggressive energy of someone trying to prove himself. "We know about the gold, Mr. Tate. We know your uncle was involved in smuggling operations. If we bring that to light, your ownership could be contested. The property could be seized as proceeds from criminal activity. Emory met his eyes without flinching. Then contest it. But you'll have to prove it, and you'll have to explain to the Northern Cheyenne Nation why you're trying to seize their cultural property. That'll make for interesting headlines. Brennan held up a hand, stopping his colleague from responding. Let's not be adversarial. We're businessmen, Mr. Tate. Everything's negotiable. Name your price. There is no price. This land isn't for sale. You're making a mistake. The eminent domain process will drag on for years. Legal fees will bankrupt you. And in the end, we'll win anyway. Why not take the money now and walk away with dignity? Sheriff Donovan's patrol car came up the track, followed by 2 knives truck and a vehicle Emory didn't recognize. They parked behind the SUVs, forming a blockade. Donovan got out slowly, thumbs hooked in his belt, and walked over with the deliberate pace of law arriving. Gentlemen, didn't know we had such distinguished visitors in the county. Brennan's smile was professionally friendly. Sheriff, we're just conducting business with Mr. Tate on private property. Without invitation. That's called trespassing. Donovan's tone was mild, but his meaning was clear. Mr. Tate asked you to leave. Time to go. We're within our rights. You're within his property line. And he's got the deed that says so. Now you can leave voluntarily, or I can cite you for trespassing and harassment. Your choice. 2 knives had walked up during this exchange, along with Sarah Cross and an older Native American woman Emory recognized as one of the tribal elders. They formed a line beside Emory, a wall of support that spoke louder than words. Brennan's professional smile cracked. This isn't over. Pinnacle Resources has legal avenues. Then use them, Sarah said quietly. In court where they belong. Not here, where you're trying to intimidate a 60-year-old man who just inherited his uncle's land. The younger associate started to respond, but Brennan silenced him with a look. He turned back to Emory. You're making powerful enemies, Mr. Tate, people who could make your life very difficult. I've made peace with difficult, Emory said. Have you? Brennan stared at him for a long moment, then gestured to his colleagues. They loaded back into their SUVs and drove away, churning up dirt and snow. The sound of their engines faded down the track, leaving silence in their wake. Donovan chuckled softly. Well, that was entertaining. You sure you want this fight, Tate? I'm sure I don't want to be the man who sold out sacred land for money. The sheriff nodded slowly. Your uncle would have appreciated that answer. Can't say I always agreed with Silas, but he had principles. Glad to see you do, too. He touched his hat and got back in his patrol car. I'll be around if they come back with attitude. Some fights are worth having. After Donovan left, the tribal elder approached Emory. She placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of blessing or acceptance. Silas chose well. You will have our support, all of it. Legal financial espiritual. You are not alone in this. 2 knives handed him a document, simple, legal, formal. A signed refusal of Pinnacle's offer, witnessed and dated. Keep this safe. It's your line in the sand. Emory took the document, feeling its weight. This was the moment everything changed. No going back now. He'd chosen protection over profit, community over isolation, purpose over comfort. His uncle's legacy was secure, and his own life finally had meaning. Spring came to the high country with the patience of something that knew its time would come, regardless of human hurry. The snow melted in stages, revealing brown grass that would soon green, wildflowers waiting to bloom, and a ranch that looked considerably better than it had 4 months ago. Emory stood on his rebuilt porch, coffee cup warming his hands, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The cabin had new windows, a sound roof, and a door that hung properly. The barn was restored enough to shelter Maudie and the 2 horses he'd acquired from 2 knives, gentle mares suitable for the wilderness guide business he was starting. The clearing had been cleared of debris, and a garden plot waited for planting near the creek. But the change that meant most to him was the sign 2 knives had carved and mounted at the property entrance. Simple cedar with letters burned deep, Tate Ranch, protected land, walking in beauty. The Navajo phrase translated roughly, but the meaning was clear enough. This place had purpose beyond ownership. It belonged to something larger than one man's life. The legal battle with Pinnacle Resources was ongoing. tangled up in courts and jurisdictional questions. But the initial eminent domain filing had been challenged successfully. Sarah Cross and tribal lawyers had argued that the land held cultural and historical significance that superseded commercial development. Pinnacle would keep trying, but each attempt would meet resistance. The corridor was protected, at least for now. Emory had used some of the clean money from Standing Rock to make improvements, pay property taxes 3 years ahead, and establish a modest fund for land conservation. The rest sat in a bank account, earning interest, waiting for emergencies or opportunities to purchase adjacent parcels as they became available. The gold from the other caches remained hidden, managed through the tribal council for cultural preservation work. It was being used as Silas intended, to protect what mattered. The sound of a truck made him turn. Martha Caldwell was driving up with supplies. Her monthly delivery run had become a regular thing, and they'd settled into an easy friendship. She'd been one of the first townspeople to openly support his decision, and her store had become an informal gathering place for others who respected what he was trying to do. Morning. Emory, she called, climbing out with a box of groceries. Brought you those seeds you wanted, and some news you might want to hear. Good news or complicated news? Good for once. Pinnacle's CEO resigned yesterday. Something about accounting irregularities and an investigation. The development project's been suspended indefinitely. Doesn't mean they're gone forever, but it means they've got bigger problems than your ranch. Emory felt something unclench in his chest. That is good news. Figured you'd think so. Martha set the box on the porch. Also, Tommy Bridger, the young deputy, asked if you'd be willing to teach some wilderness skills classes. Sheriff's Department wants their people better trained for mountain rescues. Tommy says you've got knowledge they need. I could do that. Thought you might. She smiled, the kind of smile that carried approval and acceptance. You've become part of this community, Emory, whether you planned to or not. After Martha left, Emory spent the morning working in the garden, turning soil and planning where different vegetables would go. Maudie grazed nearby, older now, but still stubborn and reliable. She'd saved his life in a way, pawing at that hearthstone and revealing the fortune that led to everything else. He'd make sure she lived out her days here, comfortable and valued. Around noon, 2 Knives arrived with 3 of the tribal elders. They'd gotten in the habit of visiting every few weeks, checking on the property and discussing plans for the corridor. Today, they brought a proposal, establishing a cultural education program on the ranch, teaching traditional skills and history to young people from the reservation. Emory would provide the space and basic instruction in wilderness survival. The elders would provide the cultural teaching. This land becomes a living classroom, the white-haired elder explained. Not a museum or a monument, a place where knowledge passes from old to young, where the past and future meet. Emory agreed without hesitation. It felt right, like another piece of his uncle's vision clicking into place. Silas had protected the land. Emory would help it serve its purpose. Different methods, same goal. That evening, as the sun set and the mountains darkened, Emory sat at his table with his uncle's journal open before him. He'd read it cover to cover a dozen times, but tonight he added his own entry on the last blank page. Uncle Silas, I found the 5th cache. I read your letter. I understand now what you were trying to tell me. It took 60 years, but I've found my purpose. The ranch is protected. The corridor is secure. I'm building something that matters. Thank you for trusting me with this burden. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to choose what kind of man you want to be. I hope wherever you are, you've found the peace that eluded you in life. And I hope Margaret forgave you. I have. Emory? He closed the journal and set it on the shelf next to the medicine bundle the elders had given him. On the wall hung the photograph of the 4 men from the Brotherhood: Silas, Guerrero, 2 Knives, and Rake. They'd been criminals and smugglers, but they'd also been complicated men trying to find meaning in a complicated world. Rake had taken the wrong path. Silas had found redemption late. 2 Knives had chosen community. And now Emory carried that history forward. Outside, stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with cold light. Somewhere in town, Sarah Cross was preparing legal documents. In the high country, the sacred sites stood undisturbed. And on this ranch, in this clearing, a 60-year-old man who'd spent his life drifting had finally found his home. Not because of gold or inheritance, but because he'd chosen to protect something worth protecting. Because he'd decided that some things matter more than comfort, more than security, more than the easy path. His uncle had been right. Time stands still for no man. But in the time you have, you can choose to build or to take, to protect or to profit, to matter or to drift. Emory Tate had made his choice. And as he sat on his rebuilt porch, watching night settle over the mountains, he knew with absolute certainty that it was the right one. Sometimes a man spends his whole life looking for a place to call home. And sometimes, when he's very lucky and very brave, he finds it in the last place anyone expected, including himself.